Welcome back everyone to another deck tech. We are here with maybe a bit of an unexpected commander, but it's BREYA, our deck for the next focus session, or one of the two next member focus sessions actually. And this is a deck list from Marcus, friend of mine and a player in our community who experimented with, or he's actually, I think, the only one I know of who experimented with the affinity plan for a bit longer than only 2 weeks. He brought it to a couple of FNMs and it worked out better and better. So he decided to bring it to a bigger tournament at the beginning of 2026. And that's why he played on cam last time. We will just have a quick look at the list and go through a couple of cards that he decided to include. Some of those cards are very obvious inclusions for, 4-color mid-rangey value reasons. Most of those cards, I would say, are rather included because they synergize very well with the overall affinity plan. And since we're playing 4 colors, we have access to quite a lot of cards. So looking at this, the Planeswalkers here, yeah, it's quite easy to understand why you would feature Teferi against a metagame that plays lots of Spider-Man. Back then at the tournament, Tazigo was not yet legal. Then again, there were still some control piles running around. To be honest, not too many, but Spider-Man was something that you have to respect. It's not like there are too many things that Spider-Man can interact with here, maybe creature-wise, but you don't want your, like the big threats, they have to come through. You don't want them to be countered. Some of those lineups really rely on having 1 or 2 pieces, things like Urza, for example, things like Iron Man. We'll get to that later. Apart from that, we have Daretti here, offers some interaction, dealing with some nasty creatures while also hiring your artifact count. Then we have Tezzeret, also here for an obvious reason. The deck does not play the Painter Grindstone combo. Still, we have a couple of CMC1 artifacts that we want to find. There is Winter Orb in the deck, and therefore we want to find the Moonsnare prototype, for example. And we have Retrofitter Foundry for the very grindy matchups. We have Portable Hole. So the suit is not too bad. Skullclamp also really, really good in addition to a BREYA cast, just drawing some cards off of those Topters. So that's definitely a thing. Over to the Creature suit. We have an Esper Sentinel because it's an artifact and it deals well with the interactive decks, and especially, as I said, against Spider-Man. That's a very interesting matchup here. It's also a very difficult one for BREYA, for this variant of BREYA. Then we have Baleful Strix, more or less because it's an artifact, not so much because of the effect, but it's a body that you see in most control decks, so it's a decent fit here too. Bazim is actually one of the better threats, almost always unblockable because you have all those historic spells, whether it's legendary or all the artifacts that you bring down. So it's always drawing a card and it will be unblockable, dealing damage, and that's one of those cards. If you don't deal with it early on, it will grow bigger and bigger, and eventually you will have some problem. The Canoness here is one of those, I would say, basic synergies that, or stacks synergies that those affinity decks usually lean on. I have to add that at the point of building and playing that deck, the Rogark Storm variant was still legal. So he was tacking a little bit against it. You also see the Damping Sphere here, which is also a really good inclusion against Lumra, by the way. But it was mainly included to have some outs against the Storm matchup, actually. Then we have Oswald as the lowest CMC pot that we can have for Affinity. A really good card. Same procedure as always. There are lots of cool tutor lines here, or pot lines in this deck. If you don't handle this guy, you will eventually walk into a Tangle Wire quite quickly, and the Tangle Wire will result in a bigger artifact. I mean, here the Moonsmithy is quite cool. Sometimes you go for the Shurikai. But yeah, there are even bigger targets to sack into whatsoever. BREYA is most likely resolving in a Chaos Defiler, for example. Mm, you can also search for Iron Man as a second pot and find something else. Definitely one of those powerhouses. We have Stoneforge Mystic, searching for a chainsaw, for example, and a skull clamp. So we have interaction on the search, and we have the skull clamp on the search. I think a previous iteration of the pile also included the pre-war formalware. However, there are not really that many cards that you could get back with the formalware, and also your commander is CMC4, so it doesn't really make that much sense. Broadside Bombardier has some insane interactions. The high CMC targets that you can throw into that. You can throw your commander into it. It's just a really, really good aggressive card. Emery, to me, is a bit on the less powerful side, but there are some pretty decent lineups with her too. A card that I would say I also picked up the deck and played it for a couple of rounds. I would say it's not necessary to play it here. Definitely not the best shell for it. Then again, having some recursion on the most important artifacts is definitely a thing. Deadpool is here mainly for the value reason. Marcus decided it's that good of a card, I don't want to miss out on it, and that's probably true. We have the Metamorph here as, yeah, goes in a similar direction with an affinity touch and not as powerful as Deadpool, but, you know, people don't really expect you to play clone effects anymore. And we have so many value ETB things happening in this format that from time to time it's definitely a good thing to have a Metamorph. Depends on what you copy, but, you know, if your opponent is on reanimated shenanigans, and that's something that happens quite a lot, at least here in our German meta, then the Metamorph is definitely good to have. Over to the one of the first affinity creatures, the Refurbished Familiar, is mostly played for 1 black, has a decent ETB, and it pots into a CMC5 target just as BREYA. So the deck plays the maximum amount of pots, as far as I know. There's Oswald, there's Iron Man, and there is the Repurposing Bay. You want to make it's very mana intense, but you want to make use of those effects. Therefore, he plays a couple of those. I have an effect on ETB, then the artifact is basically useless, and I keep on chaining it into something bigger. We have Urza here for obvious reasons. I don't need to introduce this guy. Chaos Defiler is pretty much the same. Small upside here, it's an artifact, so we can tutor it with all those effects. Then there's Iron Man. Iron Man is a card that, as a commander, we played it on cam some time ago in a focus session. I honestly had no idea this card existed up until to the point where we met a member of our community at the Relic Fest, and they told us they were on this deck, and later on sent me their deck list. And yeah, it was a really cool deck. It was a really cool deck idea, and from that point on, we had it in mind for those brews, and it fitted perfectly into that pile here. And yeah, it's doing some great work. If you have nothing to pot into, at least you can pot the treasure token that Iron Man creates. So that's just one of those cards that you think about. Okay, interesting design. Why? Why? Just let's leave it at that. Then we have the Kappa Cannoneer. That's an all-rounder for those strategies. Thought Monitor is the same and goes a bit in the same direction, I would say. It's Imskir, a card that many people tinkered with when it came out back then in Modern Horizons 3, it was. Yep. As a standalone commander, doesn't do the job. In this deck, much, much better. And, you know, there are lots of nastier interactions. Like, you get to redraw. Of course, you pay life for it, but you get to redraw. You should not underestimate the amount of artifacts that this deck can bring down to the table. BREYA brings 3 artifacts. We have effects like... never mind. This variant does not feature weapons manufacturing anymore. So there was like a very previous version that played the Pinnacle Emissary and weapons manufacturing, which was also a really cool interaction with affinity cards and broadside bombardiers and things like that. But yeah, Imski is just here for value, something that you can't pot into because it's not an artifact creature, and apparently Imsi 8 is too much to pot for that. But it fits the strategy, and it's a good fit. Then for the sorceries, we have Pending. It's a decent interaction spell these days, sometimes very costly, dependent on which creature you want to deal with. Then we have obviously the Diabolic Tutor. We have the Demonic Tutor, actually, not Diabolic Tutor. We have Fourth here for a value include, playing some of those stones. So there are some cases where we can cast this for 2 in on turn 3 in the early game, and it might win us the game because we get the Monarch token, depending on the strategy that we face. Transmute Artifact here, one of the best affinity tutors, and Thoughtcast is one of the best draw spells, I would say, for affinity decks. Then we move over to the instance, which is more or less only packed with interaction. We have Dispatch here, which is very easily enabled. So that's basically a second unconditional swords. We have the best tutor for the deck, which is Enlightened Tutor. And then we have a bunch of CMC1 interaction. There's also Metallic Rebuke here as the only counterspell, but it's almost always 8 for 1 blue instead of the rest, because you can tap some artifacts to pay for Improvise. And we also have Deadly Dispute, which is a bit of a leftover, I think, from the previous version with the more all-in strategies. As I said, weapons manufacturing and the Pinnacle Emissary, creating many more artifacts, and therefore you can play cards like Deadly Dispute to recycle them, find more valuable things, and in effect of the munition tokens from not munition. Is it munition tokens? I'm not exactly sure, but I think the weapons manufacturing is creating munition tokens, and we were actually searching for ways to get rid of those tokens in order to deal the damage once they leave the battlefield or they die. I think it's an LTB. Either way, not the worst card, can definitely do some things. Then the actual affinity shell. So let's go over to the artifacts. We have Jeweled Amulet. On the low curve, we have both baubles and a welding jar. Not much to say about this. That's a very good regeneration spell for most of the cards that we play here in this 99. Then we have the prototype that acts very well together with the Winter Orb, and that's one of the most common strategies the deck goes for, I would say, especially in combination with the stones. We have Nihil Spellbomb as some interactive tool against the graveyard decks. Again, at that point, Rogak was still legal, so that was definitely a thing. Portable Hole, and I would say now with Tazigur, even without the Storm deck, it's still a thing, to be honest. Portable Hole here being an artifact in early interaction, pretty good. Foundry, very good card in decks like that. Skull Climb, I already explained. We have Topters, and we have other things that we can throw that into, or attach the Skull Climb to, and then draw a couple of cards. Over to CMC2, we have 5 stones. 6 stones actually, with the Felver Stone for talismans and the Arcane Sickness, obviously. We have the Disruptor Flute, which is a very well upgraded version of the Pithing Needle, and in some matches this card is just pure value. I'm a big fan of that since I played Magda, and I think this card is very underrated. It could be played in many more decks. This is definitely a list that can feature it. Damping Spear, as I said, I think right now not good enough anymore. Back then, it was a perfect card against both lands strategies, which was mainly Lumra and Storm. And apart from that, I mean, if you don't want it anymore, you can always throw it into BREYA. You can recycle it and using her activated ability. And apart from that, you can also put it into something better on CMC3 or whatever. So That's what I like about the deck is you can play a couple of silver bullets, also like the Canonist. Canonist is not really a downside for you, but it's mostly played as a silver bullet against other strategies. As soon as you don't really want those cards on the battlefield anymore, you can throw them away with BREYA. Same goes for Winter Orb, by the way. If you do not have access to the prototype, then you can just end of turn. If you have 2 mana left, you can sacrifice them with BREYA, and all of a sudden you get a full untap. Same goes for the Damping Sphere. So the floor of playing those cards is always paying 2 mana plus the mana you have to activate to activate BREYA. But I think in this situation, with the metagame I described, it was perfectly fine to play that. We have Legion Extruder, which is a card that I like a lot. And again, it fits very well into the entire strategy of this pile, the stones, Winter Orb. Then we move over to the CMC3 artifacts. There is the Aegis, which is a really powerful card if you find the right target to exile. If not, you have a CMC3 exile target creature spell that, sometimes catches a very, very big creature. Sometimes it's the commander, and then you can't make use of the ability, but I think the floor of the card is acceptable, taking the ceiling into consideration. Let's move over to the Perilous Snare, which is a card that you see in Cloud most often, or a couple of white decks. But I think first time I saw this one was in Cloud. So either decks that are a bit more aggressive will feature that because they can constantly advance the speed, as it's called, and therefore use the max speed ability. But it's also just a fine CMC3 interactive artifact in that case that can buy you quite some time. I think the max speed ability here in this particular deck is not too relevant. It's mostly that you have a couple of, actually just 2 effects, but on each CMC you have something to pot into to deal with creatures or deal with some other nasty permanents that you just want to get rid of. And that's just another one, because this one only deals with creatures and this one would deal with anything else. Then we have the pot. Self-explanatory, I talked enough about pots. Tanglewire is here for the usual stacks interaction. We have Shorikai as a very good draw engine, really, really good tool against control. But also sometimes it comes in handy against aggressive strategies. If you face decks that play a lot of creatures that do not have any evasion, so you can just throw the pilot into that turn by turn until you find something that deals better with the situation. The Thousands Moon Smithy is a win condition in itself. Produces tokens that are even better than the Saga tokens because they grow by the count of creatures as well as the count of artifacts and enchantments even, right? No, only artifacts. So yeah, it's most of the time, very easy to flip that if you want to do that, which is the case because you want to create more of those Gnome soldiers. And then I think this was freshly added, more or less, a bit of an experimental card, the Demonic Junker, also another affinity card. And you have an ETB destroying creatures. It's a bit of I wouldn't say soft board wipe, but you have like a decent vehicle attached to a decent effect. And most of the time you can cast this guy for 3/2, something like this. So in the later game, I think it's quite fine. And then, only a crew cost of 2 means 2 top 2 tokens can activate the Junker, and you're swinging in with a 6/5, which is quite fine, I guess. Over to the enchantments, we have the Leyline Binding, which sometimes works, sometimes does not work, but most of the time it does work, and it's just too good to not include it. And same goes for Parallax Wave. It's there's not much to say about Parallax Wave, to be honest. I'm still under the impression that this card is way too powerful and it should be banned. But that's for another day. We can debate about Parallax Wave in the comments. Let's go over to the land base, which is pretty basic. We have 4 affinity lands. Hey, we have Urza Saga, as you expected. Then we have those rainbow lands, Bio of Industry, Starting Tone, Commando, and Reflecting Pool. And apart from that, it's whatever 4-color has to offer. We don't really have that many surveillance because, I mean, the mana curve is not too flat, but actually we do have at least 3 surveillance, to be honest. But you know, the mana curve is not too flat, so you can definitely allow yourself to search for an early surveillance. Later on, it's a bit awkward in the sequencing to draw these fast lands and stuff, and as your 4th land or like the starting town and stuff. But I think in order to cast all those spells with all the different pips, some of those we want to cast blue spells, red spells, black spells, white spells, more or less equally distributed. So we have to make sure that the mana base somewhat works. Definitely the hardest part, I would say, in brewing this deck. But I guess it worked out. You just have to be aware at any time what to search for when cracking the fetchland and stuff and whatnot, because you kind of have to know which cards are in the deck and what could appear at which point. There is no card apart from Urza Saga, Urza itself, that would cost you more than 1 pip, apart from Parallax Wave. But the deck is leaning into white and blue anyways, so that should be covered. And apart from that, it's only about the splash. So I would say the red is not even a splash. I would rather say that black is, but you know, that's debatable. And in the end, not really too relevant. Sometimes you also have support from the talismans. So yeah, here we go. That's about the list. We will go over to the matches. If you have any more questions on that or any ideas, thoughts whatsoever, put them down in the comments. We can talk about it. And if not, we will see each other in game 1 of this member focus session. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.